So we are here today on November 21st, 2022. I'm Jason Schow, and I'm here today to do an interview with my dad, Terry Schow, and this is in partnership with Congressman Blake Moore's office and also the Davis County Catalyst Center. We appreciate them letting us come here and use their facilities and use this nice setup to do this recorded interview. This is part of the Veterans History Project that the Library of Congress has ongoing right now. And so we're going to be talking with Mr. Schow about his military service and his experiences with the military before and after. So with that, we'll just get started, and I just want to start by asking you, Dad, to tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you were born, a little bit about childhood kind of leading up to high school, and then we'll start getting into your military service.
I was born in Ogden, Utah. I attended Ogden City schools. My mom had been married a number of times, and my stepdad had kind of an infrequent work history, but I went to 5 schools in elementary: Grant D, Madison, Pingree, Mountain View. I then went to Mount Ogden Junior High School for junior high, and then Ogden High School for my high school.
Growing up, do you remember relatives or friends or anyone who was in the military as a kid growing up? Any relatives, uncles, aunts, grandparents, or anything like that?
Well, my stepfather had been in the military, World War II, but he never really talked about it. I had a friend of mine by the name of Steve Brands that had served with Special Forces, so he talked about that when I worked with him at a DDO, and that kind of influenced me to want to get in Special Forces. I figured I volunteered for the military, in fact volunteered for the infantry, but he talked about the good training. I think, you know, if you got to go to Vietnam, you may as well get the best training you can, so I volunteered infantry unassigned. And that meant if I had not have passed the Special Forces qualification better, I would have been a 3-year volunteer infantry guy. But that's what I ended up doing.
How old were you when you first were talking with Steve and got his influence about Special Forces?
High school time, he and I worked together at a DDO. They had a program for low-income kids, and so we had the illustrious job of unloading boxcars at a DDO, and I can remember to this day there's 1,044 foot lockers in a boxcar. So that's when I talked to him. So it probably would have been, I don't know, 17, 18, something like that.
And in high school, were you in ROTC? Did you do ROTC?
I did do at least 1 year of ROTC, and that actually helped me get, I think, a little bit of a quicker promotion because they gave preference in basic training to folks that did ROTC.
And you graduated in 67,
1967, right? Yeah, I graduated in 67 and volunteered or joined the Army in 67. So I graduated in May of 67 and then in October reported for basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington. And then from Fort Lewis I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia for infantry training. We lived in Quonset huts out there. Those are round, half-moon-shaped buildings. And then from there I went to Fort Benning, Georgia for jump school for about a month, and then from Benning I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which was headquarters for Special Forces Training Group, and spent almost a year there of Special Forces Tactics and Techniques Phase 1. They also trained me as a radio operator, which is a 16-week course, so you learn Morse code, and then Phase 2, and so I finished up there, and then from there was assigned to the 10th Special Forces Group at Fort Devens, Mass.
Okay. And I want to talk about, I'll ask you some questions about each of your kind of training stops that you mentioned there, but I wanted to ask, you know, as you were getting ready to graduate from politically, you know, what was going on at the time with the Vietnam War, what were your thoughts as you were graduating, knowing, like you said, you volunteered, some did, some didn't, but what all went into your thought process as you got out of high school and with what was going on, you know, with the war, and what were your thoughts about that?
Well, there were some protests, but I probably remember them later, but I just felt it was kind of my duty to serve, and so that was my mindset.
Okay, so you went in, you said Fort Lewis for basic training, and that
Correct.
was how long?
About 2 months.
Do you have any specific memories or things that stand out about basic training itself?
It rained a lot up at Fort Lewis, Washington. In fact, they issued us rubber suits, rubber pants, and rubber jackets. And I remember being out there laying on the ground doing sit-ups and push-ups in the rain.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably my most vivid memory.
What was it? I know for me, when I went to basic training, it was culture shock. You know, when you first get there, did you have the same experience as far as going from civilian life in your first exposure to
I
being in the
did.
military?
I did. It was a very regimented thing. I mean, they put us in these barracks, and there were probably, I don't know, 20 or more guys in the barracks, and they were bunk beds, double-decker bunk beds, and you know, the bathrooms were no privacy and that kind of thing. And you know, you had to do PT virtually every day. They had a PT test. I remember before I finished, I think my PT score was like 442, which isn't bad out of a possible 500. But I remember you end up getting blisters on your hands from the monkey bars. You had to do the monkey bars, push-ups, and pull-ups and stuff like that.
What was the morale, I guess, among the people who, and just a basic training, you know, for this part of it, but knowing, a lot of you probably, you know, had to know you're going to Vietnam as you're starting basic training. What was the morale and kind of the spirit?
Seemed to be pretty good. Back then, the draft was still in place, so we had a cross-section. We have college guys, and then we had one little guy that I really felt bad for him. His name was Dennis Sandercock, and I think he had some mental challenges, and I thought, this guy really shouldn't be here. I just thought mentally he shouldn't be here, but that's what happens when you got a draft. You get people who have got some challenges mentally, and then you got college folks up here on the other hand, and then I was kind of in the middle, just a you know, plain old high school graduate, you know.
Okay. So you finished basic, Fort Lewis, and then where was your, did you say, what was your next stop?
Infantry AIT at Fort Gordon,
For
Georgia.
11 Bravo, and that's Fort Gordon?
That's correct, and that was about 2 months again.
Okay. And so anything memory-wise that stands out from the infantry training there at Fort Gordon?
Well, I remember, of course, they fed us meals, and you wash your trays in these 55-gallon drums, and you wash them out. And I remember more than once everybody got sick, got diarrhea, and instead of sending you, you know, go home, take it easy, they give you a bottle of Pepto-Bismol and take this and get back to work. So yeah, I remember that business.
What about the training specifically, the infantry side of it? If you can talk a little bit about what specific training exercises you were doing, what kind of weapons you were training with, things like that.
I'm trying to think. I know in Vietnam we used the M16 and the CAR-15. The CAR-15 was a modified version of the M16, shorter stock. But you know, you did a lot of live fire training stuff. They exposed you to gas. CS gas, and you know, that's some god-awful stuff, because you'd get it in your eyes and just literally sting your eyes. And then they also had you crawl under barbed wire with machine guns firing over the top of you. Obviously, you want to keep real low to the ground with those. But it was mainly firing weapons, you know, the M16. I think we did some, because infantry, you know, it's basically small arms. In the infantry, you've got light weapons and heavy weapons, which are mortars and stuff like that. We dealt primarily just with pistols and rifles and stuff like that.
Did you guys was the saw around back then or not yet?
I don't remember a saw.
Automatic, it was, you know, kind of the size of an M16. But
nope, I don't remember that, although I do remember that we used the M60 machine gun. We used the 50 caliber machine gun, and I always love it in these movies where they have someone's shoulder firing a 50 caliber machine gun. Those things are very heavy, and the likelihood, unless your name is The Rock, the shoulder firing a 50 caliber machine gun, because the bullets on a 50 caliber are bigger than your thumb. Those are good sized rounds.
Were you guys in tanks ever? Did you do any training with tanks, or what was
No.
your vehicles that you were training with?
They hauled us around a lot, deuce and a half, 2.5 ton trucks. They would also have trailers, and I call them like cattle cars. Probably put 50, 75 guys in those, but it was mainly 2.5 ton trucks, and with just canvas sides, sometimes no tops on them.
Okay, so Fort Gordon, you finished your
Yep.
infantry training,
Yep.
and then where did you go from there?
Fort Benning, Georgia for jump school.
Okay, so was that optional? Like once you were done with infantry, you decided to go to jump school, or did everybody who went to
Well, it
infantry
was a
go to jump
requirement
school?
because I wanted to go in SF. A requirement of SF is number one, you had to have 2 MOSs, and mine was infantry and radio operator, and everyone in SF has to be jump qualified. You had to go through the jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia.
And that's before you started the actual SF course,
That's correct.
right?
That's correct.
And so it's possible some people maybe who wanted to do SF might, go through jump school and then not ultimately make it to SF.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I realized later that, had I've not passed it, because you had to do what's called Special Forces Qualification Battery, and had I have not passed that, then I would have been, as I said earlier, a volunteer 3-year infantry guys. And you had folks going to Canada to get out of going in the military, so they wouldn't go to Vietnam. And here I'd signed up for 3 years worth.
So, okay, you go to jump school. Do you have
Yeah.
any memories that stand out about what that was like? And I mean, jumping out of airplanes is something that not that many people do, especially not in the military. So what are your memories or thoughts about jump school, and what was that like?
Well, jump school is comprised really of 2 or 3 parts. You've got ground week, tower week, and they have you practice jumping off of maybe a chair's height or a little higher, and then you do what's called a PLF, and you roll so that your body takes it. So you roll onto your calf, your hip, and your side, so it takes up the shock of the jump. And then the second week is tower week. They tow you up 250 feet in a tower, and then they release you, and then you just kind of float down. Of course, the ground's very soft underneath there. And then the third week is jump week. I think you had to make at least 5 jumps. And the big factor when you're jumping out of that airplane, of course, you got to keep your head down, because if you don't keep your head down, the parachute risers come up. You get nasty burns on your neck, but you jump out and you've got your hand on the reserve, and so you jump and lean forward and jump out, and then, of course, you're checking for make sure your chute deployed. If your chute doesn't deploy, it's going to ruin your day. But you do have a reserve chute on there too in the event it doesn't. And then the next scariest part is before you hit the ground, because there's a tendency to want to pull your feet up. But you got to hit the ground at some point, and so that's kind of my memory from there.
On the tower part you were talking about, so 250 feet up, this is before you were actually in a plane and trying actual
That's correct.
jumps, right?
That's correct.
But from that height, you're jumping with your chute on, and as soon as you jump off of there, you deploy it?
No, the chute's already deployed.
Oh,
These
okay.
these are deployed chutes that are already deployed, and they pull you up kind of on a cable device, and then the chute's already open, and so it's
Okay.
a fairly solid. There's no equipment. You don't have any equipment on at that point. And they've determined that man's fear of height, and I don't know who did this, is about 250 feet. If you can, but I remember another tower too. They also had a 34-foot tower that she did prior to that. But I remember most vividly the 250-foot tower.
Mm-hmm. So you do 5 real jumps as
Yep.
part of the training
Yep.
too? Okay. Anybody, once you get up in the airplane, anybody just have last minute fear that they couldn't do it, they couldn't jump, or you remember anything?
I don't remember anyone like that. I do know that you did a lot of running, and they would have these things twice around the airborne track. Here I lay upon my back, for airborne trained I cannot be. The lack of salt is killing me. And back then, because you were sweating so much, they were worried about losing salt out of your body, so they had you take 2 salt tablets. Obviously today, the health things have changed, but you wouldn't do that. But you did a lot of running, and I think that's all strengthening your legs, because your legs take a lot of shock in a jump.
Mm-hmm. At the jump school part of it, how was the morale there as far as?
It was pretty good. I
people's
mean, everybody there was volunteer, so no one was forced to be there. So the morale was pretty good. Yeah.
Were people motivated and like wanting to be there? You feel
Yeah.
like?
Oh yeah, I do.
How do you feel like the training staff was, that just in general from basic through? Fort
I
Gordon and
thought
jump
they were
school?
pretty good. I mean, I remember basic training that a corporal was almost like God. I mean, in the military scheme of things, a corporal is only 4 ranks up from the bottom, E1, 2, 3, 4, Spec 4 or corporal, but we had corporals and even, E5s, E6s that were the primary cadre. And of course, the whole idea is to take you from being a civilian to regiment you to the military way. And that, but I thought the cadre was all very high caliber.
Looking back now, you talk about becoming a soldier and your mentality. They're training you how to think and things like that. Looking back now, do you feel like you were changing at the time as you were going through this training mentally, and were those changes, do you feel like things that lasted, have lasted throughout your life now?
Well, I think so. I mean, sense of pride and discipline and, the whole business of duty, honor, country. I mean, that's instilled into you, and, that's stayed with me. In fact, that military business is really what made me want to do the veterans piece, because the military is pretty good to me. A kid whose family was very poor, what I often refer to, grew up on the wrong side of Ogden, but the military allowed me to get an education, GI Bill, buy a home, and so I've really kind of worked every since then. I mean, it was great what I did in the military, but I'm probably more proud of the work I've been able to do since then, helping my fellow veterans, getting the state veterans office operational again after being shut down in '78, and then an office and a division, and then under Governor Huntsman, actually having that become a full department. That's a pretty big deal, because in 1945 Utah had a full department, and then in 1978 it was shut down, which was a big mistake. 3 years after the Vietnam War, Utah shut down the state veterans office because you had ill-informed legislators who thought the VA did that. The VA is a great organization. They provide health care, they process claims, cemeteries, but at the end of the day, their prime mission is not outreach. But I digress.
No, that's okay. That's good. So going back, we were talking about jump school. You finished up with that, and that was how many weeks again?
3 weeks.
3 weeks, okay.
Yeah.
And then where did you go next?
Then I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is, at that time, it was home of the 18th Airborne Corps. You had the 82nd Airborne Division there, and then Special Forces Training Group was there. And I think back then, the 3rd and the 6th and the 7th Special Forces Group were at Fort Bragg as well.
So you went there to start with your Special Forces training?
Yeah, I was there for about a year. I mean, I was in training for, my gosh, a basic activity was 6 months. And then I was in training for almost another year at Fort Bragg by the time you did Special Forces Tactics and Techniques, Radio Operator School, which was 16 weeks, where you learn Morse code and stuff like that. And then Tactics and Techniques, Phase 2.
Okay, so rank-wise, when did you make your first rank advancement? By the time you got to Fort, sorry, we're talking about Bragg now, right? Fort Bragg. What rank were you when you started with the Special Forces?
I would guess maybe PFC or something. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, you don't make much rank basic in AIT, so probably PFC. And I know that I think I made sergeant by the time I got up to Fort Devens, because when I went to Vietnam, I was a sergeant E5.
Okay, so what do you remember about the training that was part of the SF Phase 1 tactics and training?
Oh, I mean, they teach you survival stuff. They teach you, if you get stuck in the woods, how you can kind of prepare meals and using pine needles. And so it's, kind of escape and evasion, map reading, compass reading, all of those kind of things. The mission of Special Forces is to organize, train, and equip guerrilla and counterinsurgency forces for warfare. So in the ideal world, I mean, our target country at Fort Devens was Yugoslavia. So they brought a professor down from Harvard University that taught us Serbo-Croatian, Srpski Hrvatsko, they call it then. But the idea is you take a 10-man SF team, 10, 12-man SF team, drop them into a country, and you've usually got 2 weapons, 2 operation intelligence, a couple of medics, radio operators like I was, and like I say, everybody in SF has 2 MOSs. Most of them probably start out at least as infantry, light or heavy weapons, and radio operator, and then engineers and demolitions and all that kind of stuff. You drop in, and then you actually work with the civilian population to help them defend themselves. I mean, I could see an SF mission in Ukraine perfectly well. We don't have any troops in there, but that would be a perfect mission to take these Ukrainians who are very proud and want to defend their country, but many in lack fundamental military skills.
How long was the tactics and techniques phase one? Do you remember?
Oh, it was probably about four weeks, something like that.
Okay, and then what was the next part of SF?
Well, the radio operator, I was in that for about 16 weeks, but sometimes you would have breaks in between because the classes don't start. And then I think phase two, I think, was probably 4 or 5 weeks as well at the back end.
What was the physical, as far as physical training or conditioning component of all?
Well, you're doing PT virtually every day. You're running every day, and the same thing, of kind of a continued version of basic training, but not quite as intense. But you're expected to, be in pretty good physical shape.
What do you recall about that part of it? I mean, by the time you were there, you were probably in pretty good shape already, but was that part hard for you at all, or did you feel pretty good about it?
No, it wasn't bad. I mean, they
keeping up
really
with the
do a
training?
good job of getting you in shape, and if you maintain it, it's not a big problem.
Okay, so after all the SF training, the year or so long, you got your certification as
Yep.
being qualified as Special Forces
Yeah, you
trainer?
get what's called the flash. You become what's called S certified. In Special Forces, your MOS is like 11B4S, meaning Special Forces qualified. And at that time, Special Forces assignments were handled out of the Pentagon at a branch called Special Categories. In fact, when I got to Devens, Fort Devens, I was on the pistol team at Fort Devens, shot the .45, and but my friend came down on orders for Vietnam, a fellow by name Benny Malto. So I called up the Pentagon and said, I want to go to Vietnam, and so they had me submit what's called a 1049. So they approved it, and I only had 10 months left to go. I mean, by the time I'd
On
done
your
all
initial contract?
yeah, in my initial 3 years, so I had spent so much time in training that I only had about 10 months left to go, but they granted me a waiver because normally they want you to spend a year in Vietnam. So they granted me a waiver, and he and I traveled across country from Fort Devens, stopped off in Iowa. My grandmother, or step-grandmother, if you will, lived there, and then we drove to Utah, visit my family, and then went over to Nevada. In fact, we figured, you're going to go to war, you might get killed. We gambled away all of our money, and we figured, why not have some fun while we're here?
Mm-hmm.
But we were so broke that they give you free drinks, and we had them give us glasses of milk because we had no money for food. And so, but my friend luckily had tucked $20 in his wallet, and that $20 got us from Nevada to California, and then we shipped out of California and then went to Vietnam and landed in country at a place called Cameron Bay, which was kind of a replacement place.
Let's go back just a little bit. So from Fort Bragg, you went to Devens next?
Correct.
Massachusetts?
Yep.
And what year would this be that you went to Devens?
Well, I'm thinking probably '69 because I went to Vietnam in January of 1970. So this might have been late '68, '69.
And how again had you known Benny Malto from Basic or some other?
Well,
training?
Benny Malto, I knew him from Devens. We were just stationed together at
Okay.
Fort Devens. Yeah.
And then he got orders to go to Vietnam.
That's correct.
When
Yeah,
you
he
had
got.
about 10 months
Yep,
left.
that's right. And when I was in my AIT training or whatever, I met a fellow by the name of Jim Wheeler, who ended up serving with me, and in fact went on to Vietnam, and from there actually ended up going to work for the CIA. I'm going to Hawaii later next year, early next year, and hope to look him up. But he was a Hawaiian guy that not only did SF, but then also worked for the CIA too.
Okay. So you travel across the country as you're both getting ready to be deployed to Vietnam. So who's the unit you're attached to that you're being deployed with?
Well, they assigned us to the 5th Special Forces Group, which was headquarters at Nha Trang, Vietnam. And at that time, they were looking for radio operators, and I volunteered to be a radio operator at a place called Camp Long Ton, which was part of the MACSOG program, and they were involved in a number of things. But I went to Long Ton It was B-53, big B-53 was unit, and Benny Malto went up to CCN, Command and Control North, which Special Forces Special Ops are CCS at Bamituit, CCC at Khartoum, CCN at Da Nang, and then they had Mike Forces, mobile hatchet teams, and that kind of thing. But you know, the A teams were operated out there different places too. But
tell me what's an A team?
well, an A team is normally comprised of 10, 12 people, and they would drop them in. They'd build a fortified encampment, sandbags, and they would be there to kind of take on the enemy as needed out there. But they would have B teams and stuff in addition. But you know, there were a few special forces camps that were actually overrun at Ben Het, Khartoum.
When you first got to Cameron Bay, is that
Yeah,
where you first arrived,
yeah.
you said? What are your first initial thoughts of being in Vietnam? And
Well, I
actually
remember it was
being there?
quite hot. I remember it being quite hot, but you know, I remember getting off the airplane and walking out onto the tarmac there, and then of course they transfer you out to Nha Trang, which was our headquarters. But that's kind of what I remember. I remember the headquarters were a lot of plaques and stuff. I mean, SF was, you know, in my view, probably one of the very best units over there, and you know, some of these guys had been in the military quite a long time. You know, I'd only been in for just a few years.
How big was the base or facility that you were on when you first got there?
Well, I don't remember that. I mean, it seemed like it was pretty good size. Obviously, it had to have been pretty good size because a group headquarters, a group is, Special Forces group is obviously smaller than an infantry division. An infantry division is, you know, normally thousands of men, but I think an SF group will have a few thousand people in it, but I don't remember exactly.
What kind of aircraft did you fly in on? And then, you know, when you first landed, were you on a regular military aircraft?
I don't
you
even,
remember, or a
that I don't
helicopter,
remember,
or-
that I don't, I mean, we did, you know, we did helicopters a lot when they'd put us in the field. They would usually put us in UH-1Bs, they would use Cobra gunships and that kind of thing. And normally when they put our team in the field, it'd be five helicopters. You got a lead ship, two Cobra gunships, and then your helicopter with the teams on it that they would put us in. But see, UH-1Bs, Hueys, in fact, they're still in practice. I mean, if you can imagine, I was in Vietnam 52 years ago, and the Huey helicopters are still in use today.
When you were going over there, or once you got there, what was your understanding of what exactly your mission was for the time that you were going to be there?
I don't know that I had an understanding. I just knew I would go and they would tell me when I got there, you know.
Day by day, you'd
Yeah,
figure
just
it out.
yeah, one
Okay.
day at a time, yeah.
What are some of the first things that you guys did as far as operational missions, things like that?
Well, you know, our unit, you know, the MACSOG program was involved in a number of classified operations, but we were involved in what was called POW snatches, and our guys would actually go in and capture guys, bring them out, bring them back for interrogation, and that was part of it. They did some operational stuff, just normal, but the infantry guys would go out and do combat operations very frequently. Ours, not so much.
Talking about going out and picking up prisoners of war for interrogation and things like that, were these actual targeted individuals that you
Yes.
were going after a particular person,
Yes.
or just whoever from the North Vietnamese might have information?
No, they would have targeted people that they would pick up, and I didn't do a lot of that because we had other people in the camp that did that. So
You weren't actually picking up the POW?
no,
Okay.
no,
Did you ever do interrogations or anything like that?
no, I didn't.
Okay. What as far as radio operation, or you were a radio operator, so what
I
specific
was.
things would you do as a radio operator?
Well, they trained us on a number of equipment. I mean, we could string, you know, a wire, get up in the trees and string it, and we used what was called the Angry 109. So we would have hand crank generators. So you'd have somebody cranking it, and then you could send Morse code, you know, 2,000 miles away, because you get if you got a clear opening, and so we would use those. We would use the PRC-25, which was a radio, between you and another guy, but we used also the PRC-77, which was a secure radio. And of course, we could encrypt our signals on the Morse, because we had what was called a burst device, and you would encrypt your message on a little pad, and the people at the other end have another pad. So you'd send a message through the clear, but then at the back end they would encrypt it, so the enemy listening to it is not, these are just random, Morse code did da, da did it, all that kind of thing, but they couldn't translate what you were doing because the messages were encrypted.
You mentioned there were regular infantry operations going on all the time by the daily people going out on patrols and missions. It sounds like when you would go out, was radio operating? Like, was it part of your job to make sure that you had a line of communication with base or communicating back? Is that part of what you would do? Yeah,
that's true. I mean, every team has radio operators, and of course your job is to make sure you can communicate back. But when they would drop in our teams, they would normally go in and would shoot up the area. I mean, I remember the aircraft they would use would be like, as I said earlier, the Huey helicopters. But they would go in and shoot up the area, and then we drop in our teams. And the first thing you do when you land is just to listen. And you have flankers on either side of you, looking at left and right. You have point men, you've got tail gunners. And so you span out in a 360, and the first thing you do is just listen to make sure there's nobody there, and then you head out. And of course, you don't want to bunch up together, and you just kind of move out. And of course, as you move out throughout the day and as you get into the evening time, you would sleep in a wagon wheel configuration, and you would put claymore mines. Claymore mines are devices about this big, and they have explosives, and they have little metal things in them, metal shards, if you will, and you point them out, and then you sleep with the clickers in your hands. And of course, you're in enemy territory. If you hear anything at night, you deploy those clickers, and then you go on, and that's what happens,
You mentioned being dropped in, so you would be going in the Hueys, and then you would jump out and use your parachutes in this.
Well, no, the Hueys, we wouldn't parachute in from the Hueys.
Oh,
No, they would actually land and drop us off. I mean, you can rappel out of there, but we had enough gear and equipment that they would land, let us off, and then they would take off.
Okay, but it's in enemy territory.
Correct,
Okay.
yeah.
I guess far enough away from any concentration of troops, hopefully, that you're at least not going to be immediately attacked when you drop.
True.
In.
Oh yeah. Oh, you're well away from any friendly forces, so you don't need to worry about that.
On those missions, when they would drop you in like that, what was your goal after you set up your perimeter and everything? What were you out there trying to do?
Well, primarily you're trying to find out where the enemy is. You're trying to find out what they're doing, and then of course report that back. And of course, if you come in contact with the enemy, that's something that they want to know about as well too. And I was not the guy in charge. I was just, as an E5 at that time, there would have been probably E7s, E6s, and you would have officers too. I mean, an SF A team will normally have captains, lieutenants, up to E7s. You might have an E8 rarely, but most of our guys were E7s and below, captains and below, so you'd have a captain, a lieutenant. But they're the guys, and our guys would also have, sometimes we'd have Montagnards. They were indigenous people from Vietnam, and then the Chinese Nungs. They were also very fierce fighters. But they ran into problems too, because if the Viet Cong found out they were cooperating with them, like if our medics would go out and give them shots, they would go up and cut the arms off of the people to teach them a lesson about cooperating with the Americans. So it was hard on those folks if they cooperated, but that was the whole idea. We're trying to help those folks defend themselves, and the Viet Cong obviously did not want them cooperating with the Americans.
How big was that force, or that part of the populace there, that you felt you could use as allies, so to speak, or to help try to fight against the Viet Cong?
I actually don't know that. I don't think they ever gave us any numbers or anything. And of course, our scope is pretty small, our operation at that time.
Mm-hmm, sure. How long would you be out in the field on one of those missions where they drop you in? Like how many days?
Oh,
before you go
usually
back
at
to
least a
base?
week, something
Okay.
like that, yeah.
And then for a week, you're just out there looking,
Yep,
listening,
yep,
trying to
yep,
assess what's going on in that
yep,
particular
that's
area.
correct.
Do you recall being engaged? Did you ever get engaged by Viet Cong while you were out on those missions?
I do. In fact, I remember, you know, we got put in, and I remember, and I don't remember how, but I remember we come in contact, and what we would do is of course, we would call for our reinforcements, call for help, and when you call them, you say, we're going to pop smoke. Yeah, different color smoke grenades, blue, red, orange, whatever. And what you do is you pop smoke by your position. And you say, I pop smoke, identify, and they will say, we see yellow smoke, that's us, that's us. And then we say 25 meters, you know, whatever the coordinates was, you know, on a compass, you give
From
them
your location.
from our location, deliver ordnance. And so they would come in and shoot up the area, you know, normally with the M60 machine guns. I mean, the Hueys were equipped with M60 machine guns, but they would also have, you know, larger rounds they could fire too, as I recall. And then, of course, the one that was the biggest threat was called a AC-130, Puff the Magic Dragon, that could put a bullet per square foot the size of a football field. These are 20, I think they were 20 millimeter Vulcans, but they had these guns. They would just come in and they would just light up the area. I mean, little could make it, but yeah, I remember that. When a bullet goes by your head, it snaps. I remember the bullet going, snapping, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But when I got back, I looked at my web gear. This is the stuff that holds your ammo belts, and part of my web gear had a little nick through it. And it was obvious that had happened because this was a new set when they gave it to me, so it had not been out and damaged before. But so clearly a bullet must have come close enough to me to nick. But I was never wounded or injured or anything like that. And of course, folks were, and I always refer to my service as, you know, many folks had it far worse than I, and many folks probably had it far better. And but you know, it was an interesting experience.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure. How far do you think, when you were engaged and being shot at, how far away do you think the enemy was, or shooting you from, or trying to shoot you from?
My guess, probably 50 yards or less.
And so you call in for help.
Yep.
And
Yep.
did they light up the area?
Oh yeah, they
Did
did come in, shot the area, and then of course they pulled us out of the field, extracted us out.
Okay.
Because that's the nice thing, you know, SF, you know, they have the ability to pull you out, and of course almost all of our units had helicopters assigned, and so in my view, some of the most heroic people in the Vietnam War were the helicopter pilots, door gunners, because, you know, they were constantly going in when people were under fire. Got so bad that they started putting steel plates in the floor of the helicopters because guys would shoot up at the helicopter, and if a Vietnamese Viet Cong shot down a helicopter, they would be moved up to the rear area, and that was a real prize for them. So they were always trying to take out the American helicopters.
Did you feel like the response was usually pretty quick? Did you feel like,
Yeah,
you know,
I
when
did.
you would call for help or backup, that they were on it
Yeah.
pretty quickly?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so the missions that you would go out and do for a week at a time or so, you did several of those, and then you were in Vietnam for a total of how many months?
10 months. 10 months. Yeah.
Did you get leave? Were you able to come back during the part of it, or come back home?
I did. I went. I had two opportunities. One, I went to Sydney, Australia for a week, and that was a lot of fun. And then I also went to Taipei, Taiwan for a week. So you got 2 week opportunities there.
But not back to the States.
You could have went back.
Okay.
The married guys would often go to Hawaii. In fact, I was later stationed in Hawaii, and Fort Derussy was an Armed Forces Recreation Center where guys would come in for Vietnam, meet their families, and they would spend a week there and then go back to Vietnam. I wasn't married, so I never did that.
So going into Vietnam and all the training you went through, you were never had a significant other or a girlfriend or anything like that?
No, not really. When I went in, I figured, I'm best not be attached. And
Sure. Okay, so any other specific things from being in Vietnam that stand out as far as just your experience in general, camaraderie, good things, bad things?
well, I thought, SF has a lot of what we call esprit de corps. I do remember that one of the guys that was stationed with me was Franklin Miller, Staff Sergeant Franklin D. Miller, and he was transferred into our unit because he had been put in for the Medal of Honor. And he served with us, and pretty interesting, kind of a crazy guy, but he went on, stayed in the military, retired as a sergeant major, and they named a drop zone at Fort Bragg after him, Franklin D. Miller. He's since passed on, but guys like him were there. I had a friend of mine that had been in Vietnam 5 years. He stayed there 5 years, just kept re-upping. And
Just voluntarily?
oh yeah, volunteering. Of course, back then, they would give you, he saved up a bunch of money while he was there. All your pay in Vietnam was tax exempt. And of course, you got combat pay, you got jump pay. And if you were proficient in something, you would get proficiency pay too.
I know, for me growing up and hearing and learning about the Vietnam War, it has a perception, obviously there was a lot of negative publicity and a strong national sentiment toward the end of it, especially against the war. What can you say about your thoughts about that, or that side of things, the background of that going on back here in the States while you guys were trying to fight the war over there?
I wasn't a fan of the protesters. I thought many of them were, kind of anti-American, and they were not supportive of our country. In fact, when I was in Vietnam, I wrote a letter to the editor, to the Standard Examiner, a thing I had seen over there called "I'm a Tired American." I'm tired of the protesters. I'm tired of people who are not willing to defend their country. And I sent that to the Standard Examiner, and next thing you know, the editor, a fellow by the name of Murray Moeller, wrote back to me and says, we're going to turn your letter into an editorial, a guest editorial, and they did that. And then he says, when you come back from Vietnam, I'd like to sit down with you and talk with you about your observations. He took me to lunch, took me over to the Standard Examiner, and that was kind of interesting to talk to a guy like that. He was probably one of the better news people to ever associate themselves with the Standard Examiner. And I guess ever since then I've had kind of an interest in newspapers, and everywhere I go I pick up the newspapers. And
kind of along the same line of what the feeling here in the United States was, I mean, the reality over there, I mean, this is a war where we lost a lot of soldiers.
58,365.
Right, and a lot more than any war since then. That's the last big war that we really suffered major casualties, I guess you could say. And so to that extent, I want to know, for that part of it, what was the feeling of the troops over there? I mean, you guys had friends and, comrades that were dying. I mean, do you remember specific people who you served with who didn't make it out, and what was that like?
Well, I don't remember anyone dying. I mean, the infantry guys were obviously at the front lines, and they were out all the time. Our situation was really more specialized operations, but my friend Benny Malto, who I traveled cross country with, was up at CCN, and he got shot up pretty bad. They lost 3 sets of helicopters taking his team out. And so, from that standpoint, I obviously feel bad. I've got a friend of mine, Frank Mon, this Purple Heart guy as well, too. So obviously I have high regard for the Purple Heart guys, and I probably have a special place in my heart for the infantry guys. Guys like Casey Kittimer, who served with the 442nd, and Frank was a a cavalry guy, an air cav guy. But the infantry guys and those who have received the combat infantry badge have clearly had it harder. You know, there are a lot of what I refer to as Remington Raiders, shoe clerks, guys like that were not exposed to harm's way. And of course, there's folks that, you know, at the height of the Vietnam War, there were 550,000 troops, I believe. But for every person on the ground, there's 10 support people, at least 10.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got an infantry division at 10,000 men, there's, you know, another 90,000 back supporting them. I mean, you got the whole supply line, and you know, I think about that when you look at some of these battles, you know, in the olden days, Greeks and Romans, and how they get all the logistics. I mean, it's a big logistical operation just to get the food there and the armament and all of that kind of stuff. And even when you go out in operation, I mean, you pack a bunch of magazines, and you know, you've got grenades, and you've got claymore mines, and your rifle, and you know, you can carry a lot of stuff out, and it takes a lot of people to provide that. And sadly, at the end of the day, a lot of the defense folks do fairly well because of war, because they make a lot of money producing armament. And I don't know, I think the only challenge I see with Vietnam is I think that sometimes the military wasn't able to fight the war. They would have liked to have fought it. You know, you're supposed to stop at at a certain point, and had they been able to fight the way they thought, they probably would have been better. But you know, you had the Chinese who were helping the Vietnamese, and you know, our folks would recover Chinese weapons and that kind of thing. So you weren't just fighting North Vietnam, you were really fighting China, and I think, as I recall, I think the Russians were involved there too. But you know, the British were there. I remember Australians were there, and I know when you were in Afghanistan, I mean, you had French folks were attached to you when you were up at the 101st. But you know, military veterans have a bond that few people understand, having shared that, especially people who have been in a combat situation. But
was there a sense of that on the ground with the troops, though, that you guys were fighting more than just the North Vietnamese? Like, were the troops at the time, do you feel like, sensing that you didn't have the political support of the government to be able to do the mission the way you wanted to, or do you more feel that way in retrospect?
I think in retrospect, I think back then we didn't know. I mean, you know, we had, you know, we got stars and stripes, and you would get those on occasion, but it's not like today where you pick up your phone and there's Yahoo News and Google News, and you know instantaneously. Back then, stuff would go on, we wouldn't know for weeks, and even stars and stripes could be, you know, quite a ways out. So it's not as though you'd pick up CBS or ABC or whatever. So we didn't know what, we knew there were protests going on back in the States, but beyond that, we had no real clue about the bigger picture in terms of who was supporting who, you know.
Okay. The numbers you mentioned, I think, put it a little more in perspective. 550,000 in country at a time.
Well, not in country, but I think that's
total?
in the size of the force, yeah.
Okay, okay. As far as the numbers that we lost in comparison, I guess I'm just thinking about Afghanistan and like the number that was in country when I was there, 60,000. You know, and then versus how many people we lost in that war compared with Vietnam. It's obviously a much larger scale. Vietnam was, I'm saying. And, you know, my sense, you know, growing up and watching movies and learning about the war, you know, through movies in a little bit, Full Metal Jacket, you know, and that's the picture I have, you know, vividly about, maybe what Vietnam was like. But you've seen the movie, right, Full Metal Jacket? I've always wondered, what do you think about that and the way it portrays the war? Is it accurate at all?
Well, I think that to some degree there is. I mean, I've got several of my friends that were infantry guys, and of course, you know, they would put them out in the field for 30 days at a time, pull them back, and they were conducting operations the whole time they were doing it. I remember one time they assigned me out to a radio relay site, and you know, you sit out there in a kind of a higher tower thing, reinforced with sandbags and that kind of thing, and they even assigned me to a fire support base. Fire support base is where you're in a forward area, and you know, you're there pretty close to where the enemy is, and at night we would do something called a mad minute. And because there was nothing but enemy out in front of you, at random times throughout the night, your job was to fire into the perimeter. Now that was done for a specific reason. If anyone's trying to creep up on you, they never know when a mad minute's going to appear, and a mad minute will ruin your day, because if everybody's firing into the perimeter, really at ground level, it could really mess you up. And that was a fairly effective tactic. But
How often did you say? Once an hour?
well,
Or
no, they
during the
do
nighttime?
periodically. I
Just
mean,
kinda
I don't.
randomly?
At least once a night, and I don't remember. But I just remember being assigned to that fire. It was Fire Support Base Zeus, and remembering that you participated in that. That they called it a mad minute.
Any other specific things you can remember from your tour in Vietnam, or things that stand out in your mind that we haven't talked about?
No, I consider myself fortunate. I was not injured. It was, I consider it to be noble service. I was proud to have served, and as I said, many had it worse than me, many had it better than me, but it's a good experience, and it kind of helped identify me for my work in the veterans world afterwards. I mean, like I said, I do much of my veterans work because of my experience in the military.
So at the end of your tour, you finish up. How did it work as far as getting you back here? Do you remember the logistics of coming back home? Or
It's not as, it's a little different today, because they basically, obviously they probably would have brought me back to Nha Trang, the headquarters, and then I can't remember if they took me to Cameron, but then they shipped me back to the States, I think back to like Washington State or something, and then to home. And I don't remember anything in particular without processing. That's something that we've learned, is that this out processing is so important, because when you go in the military, it does a physical head to toe. When you get out, they're supposed to do another one to help determine, is your hearing got worse, you got problems with your hips, your knees, your back. I mean, as you've heard earlier, I used to jump out of airplanes and that kind of thing. But the physical thing, most guys come back from Vietnam never had any physical, so they don't have the end point exam of, do you have hearing problems, or what problems do you have. And the military does pretty good keeping your records, and those records are supposed to be sent back to the National Personal Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The problem is they had a fire there many years ago, and they destroyed millions of records. So there's guys that had their personnel records and their health records that were destroyed. And one of the things I like today that they do, I've seen guys that will come to me with a CD with all their health records on it. Man, that is so helpful, because we're trying to file a VA claim. It'll say, this guy had this episode at this time. Then we can establish that it's an in-service injury. And then if it's continued today, say incident here, and today still's a problem, then we can service connect it. So those records are vital.
It seems like a lot of Vietnam veterans, specifically coming back from fighting in the war, weren't very well received, and were treated poorly. What can you say about that? And from your own personal experience, did you see any of that when you came back to the States?
It didn't happen to me, but I know I've talked to my friends who were treated very poorly. They were spit upon, the war protester types. And my view is, hate the war all you want, but I love the warrior. These guys went and did what they thought was right, and but it's these draft dodgers who are sitting back here who never went, and they would attack those people who went to serve their country. But yeah, I've heard about it, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Vietnam guys obviously want to make sure that current conflict guys are treated well. So as a result, I think you see an outpouring of support for people, current conflict, because the Vietnam guys say, we don't want what happened to us to happen to these newer guys.
What did you do next as far as work? Was that the end of your contract once you came back from Vietnam? Were you done?
I did. I ETS'd. I mean, I went in October 67. I got out in October 70. So that ended my time, and I got out, and then, did a few things. I ended up going back in because I was interested in studying some martial arts, and so I volunteered to go to Hawaii again and got assigned to the 25th Infantry Division at Schofield Barracks.
How long were you out between Vietnam and when you got back?
Oh, I got out in
Hawaii?
October 70, and I went in probably May of 72, so I don't know, less than 2 years, 18 months or so.
Okay. You said you were interested in martial arts, and that's partly why?
I was, yeah. I'd studied martial arts in Ogden with a guy by the name of Ed Riding. He was a Shotokan guy, and I'd done some training with him, and then I wanted to go study under a guy in Hawaii by the name of Joe Black, who was trained under a Professor Imperato. And the ironic thing is I went there to do that, but just never made the connection. I ended up with the 25th, and I'd done some volunteer police work, and so I requested and got transferred to the 524th MP Company. It was an MP company stationed at Fort Shafter and at Fort DeRussy, and so I left the 25th, went over there, and then I started working on my college. I did an associate's in police science, and then I did a bachelor's while I was there, and I was working full time, which was kind of hard. But you know, I did 2 years or 4 years of college in 2 years while I was working full time. But I knew at the end of the day having the education would be worthwhile. But it was a lot of fun work. We were at the USARPAC headquarters at Fort Shafter, Hawaii, and at that time they had like 15 general officers there, a 4-star general, 3, you know, 1-star generals were like nobody. There were probably 10 1-star generals there, and our job was to secure that. And then towards the end I was stationed at Fort DeRussy. But one of the more memorable things I liked is that we were involved with security for nuclear weapons. We were what was called part of the personal reliability team. It was guys that actually went through additional screening, and you helped secure the nuclear weapons. And that was a pretty big operation because, you know, you'd bring in 2 Chinook helicopters, then you'd have a couple of Hueys again that were security. The nukes would be brought in, and we'd form a perimeter around the nukes and wore flak jackets, steel pots, and the whole bit. And we were under very strict orders. You'll tell somebody once to step back away. If not, you just shoot them. I mean, because you're dealing again with nuclear weapons. But that was kind of a, you know, a high level, kind of a prestigious assignment, and I enjoyed being part of that.
How long was your contract you signed for the second time when you went to Hawaii?
From 72 to 76.
So 4 year?
Yeah, 4 years, and then while I was there, I said I worked on my associates and my bachelor's, and then from there I went back to Fort Devens again with the 10th SF group.
From Hawaii, that's where
yeah,
you were
from
next.
Hawaii. Yep, I went back to Fort Devens, and when I was at Fort Devens, and I mentioned this before, but our target country was Yugoslavia, so they brought a professor down from Harvard University. For about a year, he taught us Serbo-Croatian, and during that same time, I was on the pistol team, and that was not bad duty. It was a 45. They paid me to shoot the 45, and I probably went through about 10,000 rounds of ammo. Our team was actually a pretty good team. We took the pistol matches at Fort Devens for combat pistol, standing, kneeling, dual, and prone, which of course is on the ground. And then we went and participated in the FORSCOM regional pistol matches at Fort Meade, Maryland. And we thought we were pretty good, but we got ate alive by the Tennessee National Guard. Those guys are so good. Of course, these guys all hunt for food and the whole bit, and we shoot little paper targets. But those guys were good. But you know, that was a lot of fun to be on that pistol team. And
did you guys take second?
oh, I don't even think we did that good. I don't remember. I mean, we did first at Fort Devens, but then, you know, one of the other we got to do a couple of fun things at Fort Devens. We were asked to go down and participate in the Veterans Day Parade in Boston. That was kind of fun. And then they sent us up to Quebec, Canada, to commemorate the Americans who had died in the Battle of Quebec in 1776. So one of our A teams, and I was part of it, we were sent up to Quebec, and that was kind of a fun assignment to go to another country, and the Consul General hosted us and that kind of thing. And then another fun thing we got to do is we got to do an A-team demonstration up at Lake George up in upstate New York, and they brought our team in and we put on a A-team demonstration. But those were some of the fun things, you know.
Who was watching, or who were you putting it on for?
You mean at Lake George?
Uh-huh.
I guess just the civilians there. I don't know who they were, but for a while I was a driver for the group commander of Colonel Vernon E. Green, and he was an infantry guy in World War II, got a battlefield commission to first lieutenant, had like less than a high school education. But he was a pretty impressive guy, and then ended up retiring as a full colonel. He was commander of the 10th Special Forces group up there, but that was fun to serve with that guy.
Going back to Hawaii, I just want to talk a little bit about, so you met, how did you meet my mom, your wife, June?
Well, she was working in a little market in Ogden, DePalma's Market, 730 20th Street. Ray DePalma was a World War II veteran. And when I moved up there, you know, we went, as I said, to 5 elementary schools. I moved up there on Liberty Avenue and did different jobs. Our family was very poor, shoveled sidewalks, mowed lawns, and then I got a job with Ray DePalma, and then later on met your mom there. She was working there too, and so, you know, here we...
So you met her before you went into the service then?
No,
or was it
no,
after?
it would have been... it would have been afterwards. It would have been after I came back in '70. So,
okay,
in that
between the
interview,
two
yep, between
stints,
and then I
okay.
went in '72, and then she then came in and joined me over in Hawaii. And
Okay, so you guys got married shortly before you went over
yep,
to Hawaii?
that's or afterwards. Yeah, yeah, thereabouts. Yeah, we got married in well, this February is 50 years.
Yep.
This February, 50 years. In fact, we're going back to Hawaii because that was our first assignment, and we're taking our family back there for our 50th anniversary.
And thank you for that, by the way.
No, thank you.
So then she went with you to Fort Devens too after the 3 years in Hawaii?
That's correct, that's
you guys
correct.
went to
Yep.
Fort Devens, and
Yep.
Were you in E6 by then, or when did you
Yeah,
go
I
to
was.
E6?
Yeah, I was. I probably made. Trying to think. Yeah, I must have been at Devens. I'm thinking, but I can't remember for sure. You know.
Okay, and so how long were you at Fort Devens then for that phase?
Well, I got out in '76, and I think I finished up in Hawaii in like '75. So I was only there for a year or two. But you know, pistol team and that kind of stuff. That was.
And then
kinda
did you
tough.
get out altogether after that?
I did. I got out in '76. Yeah.
Okay, and where did you go next?
Well,
Back to
we
Utah,
came back
or-
to Utah, and then I went to work for the state of Utah because I'd had by then associate's and bachelor's degree. I went to work for the state of Utah as an investigator, and did that for a number of years, and then got into the veterans thing. I'd been interested in veterans, and so I got involved doing it. I'd been doing volunteer work with the DAV and with the American Legion and that kind of stuff, and ultimately, when the state veterans office had been shut down in 1978, 1978, Governor Bangerter had appointed me as a member of his Veterans Advisory Council, and then I went on and became the chair. But we realized the office had been shut down and what was happening with veteran preference, and so we got the Veterans Office resurrected again to a one-person office. In fact, Governor Bangerter let me do the interview questions, did the interview, and we selected LaVon Willis. And I was chair of the Veterans Advisory Council then, and then we helped LaVon, and then eventually, you know, we're able to, they built a veteran cemetery and put that underneath the health department because LaVon's office was a very small little office under Community Economic Development. Then when LaVon retired, I decided that I wanted to try and go and try and continue to help things, and so they did interviews, and I was selected as the director. And during that time, then we moved from an office to a division under the National Guard, and that was hard, because when the National Guard wanted an armory and we wanted a veterans home, their prime mission is a military peace. But we did that, then we were able to pull the cemetery, which had been placed under the Department of Natural Resources, and the veterans home that had been placed under the Health Department, they put that under a division in the National Guard. And then even later after that, Governor Huntsman, before he left, agreed that we could become a department again. And now, to tell you how significant that is, we were a department in 1945, and then, as I said, we're shut down in '78. And all that time, Health and Human Services, all the legacy agencies were building staff, funding, and they shut us down. And when we started the Veterans Office again, the appropriation for that office was $50,000. $50,000. The office was so underfunded that we went out to state surplus and got surplus furniture to furnish that office. And then I helped Levon do a lot. Levon was not very well connected in the veterans community, so I helped him run the interference because there are a lot of alligators in the pits out there, people that didn't want this to happen and that happened. But I basically kind of helped Levon and then get in the office back as a division and then to become a department. That was a big deal, but we were still funding challenged. I mean, I remember going in asking for $100,000 in the governor's office. By then, Governor Huntsman had left, and they didn't want to support it. But I talked to friends in the legislature who support us, and a fellow who was our great friend was Commissioner Scott Jenkins. He was Senate Minority Leader, and I told him of the need. I told him the governor wasn't up supporting it. I said, I'm not here asking for these funds, but if we had these funds, here's what we could do with them. We got our $100,000. But, you know, it's because of guys like him and Greg Hughes, who was our great friend. Speaker Greg Hughes did the Purple Heart tuition waiver. But a lot of people were supportive of us, and we couldn't have done it without great community support. And but to go from an office to a division, to a division and a department, and to go from no veterans homes, we now have 4 veterans homes in the state. But it was a big lift, and but it was hard because at times you're going against elected officials who will openly say they support veterans, as long as it doesn't cost them any money. And you know, there are times George Wallen, who is one of my dear friends, Medal of Honor recipient at Iwo Jima, would go with me up on Capitol Hill, and we would walk from office to office asking them to support. The Ogden Veterans Home cost $20 million to build, but the state of Utah front-loaded the entire cost to build that home. And they says, well, how will you get your money back from the feds? Senator Hatch will get us our money, because the land to build that veterans home in Ogden, Senator Hatch helped us get that. Major General Peter Cook, commander of the 96th Regional Support Command, agreed that we could transfer the land from the Browning Army Reserve Center. And then Senator Hatch did a legislative conveyance for us. So we got 13 acres there, 10 acres for the home and 3 acres that was wetland. But that home, that $20 million that the legislature front loaded, when the feds reimbursed us back our $13 million, we used 6.5 for the state share to build the Ivins home in Washington County, 6.5 to build a Payson home in Utah County. So that one home got us 3. And I mean, these are multi-million-dollar operations. I mean, the average veteran, the cost of care is about $200, $225, $2.50 a day. And the veteran, unless they have a disability, only pays half of that. But if you're 70% or higher, the VA pays all of it. If you're in for a service-connected reason, the VA pays all of it. But if you do the math, 120 beds in Ogden, 81 beds in Payson, or 108 beds in Payson, 108 in Ivins, and then Salt Lake is 81 beds. And they're building another home down south. But the veterans homes, the economic benefit to veterans and some spouses is significant. But it's, you know, I've had lobbyists tell me that it was no small feat to go from no office to a division to a department. And that's one of the things I'm happy to talk about on this, because I feel a sense of obligation to make sure that history is known, that, you know, we were shut down, but it was hard. And, you know, when you have legislators who shut down a veterans house who think that the federal government doesn't, federal government does a lot. I mean, the VA is a huge organization. They have over 400,000 employees, about 350,000 of them on the healthcare side, 50,000 in the compensation and pension and the cemetery deal, but they're prime providing care, processing claims, but outreach has always been a big deal, and I've constantly said, you know, we need to do more outreach and that kind of thing, you know.
Let me go back a little bit, because I forgot to ask you, when you got out of active duty, you ended up going reserves at a certain point, didn't you, and did some more time in the reserves?
Yeah, I was in the National Guard for a period of time, that's right. Yeah, I was in an MI unit. I was with the 19th SF for a period of time after I came back, so I did some guard time. And then I was also assigned to the 142nd MI group, and they even sent me over to Fort MacArthur, California, to learn interrogation stuff. So I had about 7 active and 7 reserve time.
When did you get out of the reserve?
Oh my goodness, let's see, 67, 76. I would guess probably 80s somewhere. I don't remember exactly
So
when.
when me and Amy were real young, there were still a couple years.
I was,
you were
yeah,
doing
I
drills,
was, yeah, because I
probably.
remember driving down to Camp Williams. I remember going to drills up on Sunnyside Avenue. Yeah, I would go do those drills, and yep, I did that for a period of time.
You mentioned also kind of how when you got back, you got involved with a number of organizations, veterans organizations. What made you want to do that after having, served and been active?
Well, a couple of things. June's dad, my wife's dad, Wendell Hanson, was a World War II veteran, and he wanted to go to the DAV meetings and the VFW meetings. So we started off taking him to those meetings, and ironically, the VFW meetings, they were smoking, and I said, this guy's got respiratory problems. Is there a chance that we could, we'll put up a fan, and that didn't work, so he stopped going. But we took him to the DAV meetings, and so June and I actually would go to the DAV, and she did DAV auxiliary, but Phil Facara, who I met there, was a World War II infantry guy, Purple Heart guy, Silver Star. And so that's really how we kind of got involved initially doing that kind of stuff, and then got involved with the American Legion as well too, and then being a member of the Veterans Advisory Council.
That was with Governor
Bangerter,
yeah.
Governor Bangerter appointed us to that, and also was involved in building the Vietnam Memorial on the west lawn of the state capitol as part of the committee.
I remember going there a number of times for big, long meetings. Probably 10 when you guys were putting that together.
Well, and that was a big deal. I mean, the same granite that's used in the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, and that's located on the west lawn of the state capitol. But we had some battles to get that in there, and we did get a little appropriation from the legislature, but the Governor Bangerter helped us with that as well too. But I remember we wanted to put a flagpole up at the Capitol there, at the memorial, and the Capitol Preservation Board said that it would interfere with the vista of the Capitol. And one of our members wrote this very strong 2-page letter saying that the American flag is never an inappropriate vista. Signed Lou Ross, descendant of Betsy Ross. That's a true story. Lou is a Vietnam guy. We got the flagpole up and got it done. But over the years we've had to fight many battles like that, and it was hard because you have people who say we love veterans, and as one of my friends, a retired general, says, they love to wrap themselves in a flag as long as it doesn't cost them any money. But I mean, I had them play games with me, locking my bills up in the Rules Committee. In the legislative world, you file a bill, goes to a committee, it's voted on the House floor, and then it goes over the Senate, same thing again. If any step of the way, if anyone wants to stop that, all they do is throw it in the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is where you hold bills that you don't want to vote on. Because when we were working on the Veterans Home, I had at least, 20, 22 votes out of 29, so I had more than enough to pass it. And they knew I had enough to pass it, but leadership in the Senate, for whatever reason, didn't want to appropriate the funds to do it, so they would play those games, and I'd have to go in and talk to our friends. And so we spent a lot of time up there just lobbying these guys and trying to convince them of the right way. And you learn that the public loves the military, they love veterans, and these folks who were obstructing us, not so much, But even when we're trying to build the Veterans Home, they're trying to build a soccer stadium down in Salt Lake. Charlie Trentleman, a former reporter for the Standard Examiner, recommended that we take a soccer ball down to the Capitol and say, are veterans more important or soccer ball more important? And Senator Kurt Bramble, who is a very abrasive, obnoxious fellow, came up to me and told me that if we brought a soccer ball down there, we'd never get a Veterans Home. And we end up building a Veterans Home in Utah County. But you see these guys who would want their constituents to believe how much they love veterans, but yet they would throw roadblocks down our way to try and stop us. But at the end of the day, we knew that persistence and determination alone were omnipotent. But we were on the side of the angels. I mean, we knew that and Charlie Trellman wrote a number of good editorials for us, or stories that helped us. And at the end of the day, it was hard, but when you consider that every state has a veterans office, and Utah didn't have one, when you consider that most states have a House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Utah doesn't. We have something close to that now, where they formed a Veterans and Military Commission, and that allows us to run bills in there, have kind of a pre-screening before this committee. But it's hard, but see, it hurt us when we shut down the Veterans Office in 1978. We lost all of that, and I mean, in the United States Congress, there's a House and a Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and all veterans-related legislation has to go through those committees. And in a perfect world, there should be a House and a Senate Veterans Affairs Committee in Utah, but that's one of those battles that we may or may not get. But you know, it becomes hard. I mean, even though I retired in 2013 after 35 years, I still continue to be involved today because I know there's so much work left to do. And since I've retired, I volunteer as a service officer to help veterans and their families, because I know that maybe these people are just overwhelmed by the system. This system is so complex and can be so hard. And if you're a lady who's just lost her husband, she just is beside herself on what do I do. So we try and help with that. And as I said, I volunteer as a service officer to do that, and I'm on a Veterans Military Commission legislature formed. And the VA has been kind to me in that they had me, I was on a rural health committee, and Secretary Shinseki asked me to chair that committee before he retired. I am now on another VA committee, what's called the Readjustment of Veterans, and that's for combat veterans who have come back, and sadly some of them don't make it. As you know, we've got a fellow that we know, 42 years old, took his life 2 weeks ago. That means that the system failed. It's a break in the system. Although we got this young man connected to the VA, got him to the PTSD. If only we knew, you know, because we did this day, depending on whose numbers you believe, 20 to 25 a day are still taking their lives. And not all of those are combat veterans either. Now, this guy was a combat veteran and actually was an officer. But so, you know, we try and figure out what does it take to get these folks. Some of them will avail themselves of our services, some won't. Some become depressed, some of them withdrawn, and some of them will treat it with alcohol and substances, and it's a real challenge. But you know, that's to try and figure out that puzzle. And so we advise the VA on what we think they need to do. And the VA developed vet centers back in the 70s to help combat veterans, because they guys were coming back from Vietnam with post-traumatic stress. But the vet centers are probably one of the single best thing that the VA does, because combat veterans can go in and see them, and they provide them counseling, suicide prevention if they're starting to go that direction. But the vet centers do great work, and in fact, my little American Legion post here in Ogden, actually one of the largest American Legion posts in the state, we have an arrangement where we allow the vet center to come over and actually do group sessions, because their little facility out in North Ogden is too small. So the battle continues. The battle continues.
To your point about, I guess everything that you've done in being involved after being in the service and all the organizations that you've been in, and then ultimately becoming, that's what you did full time, is you became the State Director of Veterans Affairs, appointed by Governor Huntsman, or
That's
was it
correct.
before
That's correct.
Huntsman?
Well, I was the division director, and I'm trying to think who appointed me. Maybe Governor Leavitt appointed me. So I was the director of the Division of Veterans Affairs, and then by later on, Governor Huntsman came in, and
That's when it became a department.
yeah, it
with
became a
Governor
department.
Huntsman.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then it became part of the governor's cabinet, and so Governor Huntsman appointed me as the executive director, they call it, of the Utah Department of Veterans Affairs.
And you spoke about it being an easy cause to kind of promote, and on the political side, the politicians have to be kind of careful with how they deal with Veterans Affairs to not offend a big part of the populace, and that kind of speaks to a difference and a change of what's evolved in the national outlook on service and veterans and our appreciation for them, it seems like now versus when you were coming back from Vietnam. Do you see that too, and do you agree that there's been a more of a positive shift despite the challenges that are still there with people coming back from deployments and being in combat and post-traumatic stress? Do you feel like it's overall better? Are we doing better now than we were when you came back from Vietnam?
Oh, I think so. I think markedly so. You know, the World War I veterans, they marched on Washington because they were treated so poorly. The World War II veterans, there was such an outpouring of love and support for those guys. And then Vietnam come along, not so much. And then the current conflict guys. And I think the system is better. I think the outreach efforts are better. The mental health stuff is better. The VA is a world-recognized experts on post-traumatic stress, polytrauma. No one knows more about elderly veterans than the VA. They're the largest provider of geriatric care in the world. So they're a good system. I had a friend of mine, a World War II veteran. His son said he was trying to get him in the VA and he wasn't doing good. Well, the VA got him in and worked him up, and they took him off half his meds and his health improved markedly, but that's because of their expertise in the geriatric care. But I think between the vet centers, and every vet center's got a suicide prevention person, they've got post-traumatic stress teams, they've got social workers, they've got psychiatrists, they've got psychologists. The vet centers, most of the vet center counselors are combat veterans, and so they have a unique understanding of what it takes to help these. But there's still so much left to do, because many folks have been reluctant to apply. I mean, I've had folks tell me, I had a guy that was shot, and well, I'd rather care for somebody worse off than me. Son, you were shot. Are you kidding me? But he would go up in the mountains. He was very reclusive, and you know, he was rated 10%, and we were able to get him rated 100% very quickly. But there's a guy that needed help. So many of these guys are so humble and so modest that they're afraid to apply for their benefits. And the benefits mean a lot to these guys. I mean, even a property tax exemption that Utah does, you've got folks that can't physically do this stuff, like go down and repair their sprinklers. If you're missing a hand, missing an arm, how do you repair your sprinklers? You just don't. So that property tax exemption helps. And you know, there's you know, for those who are willing to step up, you know, certainly the country, and I think most people agree that we owe them a high debt. And but I am not a great fan of people who go out with the attitude of "you owe me." No, thanks for what you do, country, but I do not like folks who say, "Well, I'm a veteran, therefore no." You went and you served, thank you, and we will certainly acknowledge that. But sometimes these folks are, I'm not a fan of that.
Speaking a little more about the national sentiment, do you feel like, because I've always thought, you know, that with 9/11, when 9/11 happened, you know, post 9/11, there was a big change, it seems like, in national unity and coming together, kind of. And I've wondered if maybe the fact that we were attacked on 9/11 makes people maybe appreciate veterans more now in modern day, because that's in our recent memory still a little over 20 years ago that happened. Do you see that at all, as that direct attack on our country maybe re-energized the unity and brought people more around to recognizing how important it is to treat veterans with respect and really hold them in high esteem?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, anytime someone attacks this country, the American people as a unifying force will wrap themselves around the arm of those who are willing to go out and defend their country. So you're right. I mean, remember Toby Keith had a song about defending this country, and so I think people do, and a lot of people join the military because of that attack, and who certainly want to defend themselves. But it's a challenge. I know that I've talked to folks, and even the way we withdrew from Afghanistan, I thought it was a deplorable mess. And we left billions of dollars worth of equipment over there that are now in the hands of the enemy. Are you kidding me? I mean, they are probably now, with that equipment, probably within the top 10 military armed forces in the world now because of that equipment. Now, I just don't think it should have been handled that way. I think we should have brought the equipment back, or we should have destroyed it. I don't care. But at the end of the day, leaving that world-class equipment over there was a big mistake, and I just think was poorly handled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. As you look back, just in general, on your service, the fact that you chose that path, have you ever, when you look back, do you wonder and think, oh, what would life be like if I hadn't decided to volunteer for the Army right out of high school and end up going to Vietnam? And, without the military, have you ever pictured that, like what track your life may have taken?
Well, probably a life of mediocrity, I guess, if you will, because it's a cause, it's a purpose, and the military, as I said, was good to me. A kid who grew up on the wrong side of the town in Ogden, but between the education, the home loans, and all that kind of stuff, and the fact that I'm able to help veterans today. In fact, one of the congressional staffers said to me, within the past month, because a veteran had asked a question in a meeting and I'd answered it, and she says, "Terry, what would we ever do without you? Your knowledge, your commitment, and understanding of such a wide," because I'm pretty good in the veteran space. If I don't know the answer, I know who does know the answer. But that was such a compliment because I so respect this person. But as I often say, this is noble work. It is noble work. And I even said to Governor Huntsman before he became the ambassador to China, I said, "Sir, we're doing the Lord's work here, looking after veterans. Some people went on a mission to Detroit. Some people went on a mission to Japan. But I went on a mission to Vietnam. And I'm doing the Lord's work. Because so many of these people are so overwhelmed and so confused. And, it's taken me a long time. I had someone say to me one time, "Have you got an hour or so that you could tell me what you know?" I says, "This is a 30-year knowledge base here. It's taken me more than 30 years, now more like 40 years. But the VA world is complicated. I mean, it took us 10 years to get a veterans home. Mm-hmm. It took us another 10 to get a vet center in North Ogden. Mm-hmm. We're going to get a veteran cemetery up here in South Ogden. But at the end of the day, you keep fighting, you keep fighting, you keep fighting. And after a while, you win. But I do follow the admonition of Winston Churchill to never give up. And even though some people say, well, you're retired, that's true. I am retired and I have direct access to the VA system for my home. I can access any of the records that we do, but as long as I'm able, I want to be able to help those who can't. Because there are bottom feeders out there who actually charge veterans to file for their benefits. And to me, that is despicable, because a veteran has already paid the price of admission by his service. But there's still so many humble and modest guys, World War II guys, and even Korean guys who have often felt that they were overlooked. But it's certainly honorable and noble work, and I'm most proud to do it.
Looking back on your service in general, do you have any regrets at all? Anything you would have done differently, or are you glad with how everything turned out?
Oh, I think, at times I thought it'd be nice if I would have retired from the military, but at the end of the day, everything worked at the time that it did, and the fact that Governor Huntsman come along and had faith in me and thought I could do a job, and he said to me one time, he says, "We selected you, Terry, because we knew that you had a big heart for veterans." And I think that's the key. In life, anything that you love, you're going to do well. I mean, I did it for a volunteer. They paid me for a little while, and now I'm volunteering again. But clearly, if you care about it, and I do, and I still have a few people that will return my phone calls when I've got a veteran. In fact, I've got one right now. This lady who her husband died more than a year ago filed a VA claim, and it appears that her claim just got lost in the system, but the VA people will help me rectify that and get her money back. But
right, I think with that, unless you have any last remarks, I think I've asked the questions that I wanted to ask, and wanted to say thanks again for asking me to do this and letting me be the one to do this and ask these questions on a lot of things that are in some ways sensitive, and I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for your service, and thank you for instilling in me the desire to want to serve, because I'm glad that I serve too, and I appreciate your time and doing this interview today.
It's my honor. Thank you.